The Seven Deadly Sins, exploring the biology of being human. Guy Leschziner in conversation with Ethiran Kathiravan. Professor Guy Leschziner is a consultant neurologist at Guy's and St. Thomas Hospitals and a professor at King's College London, specializing in neurology and sleep medicine. He is an author, radio presenter, and a regular contributor to podcasts and newspapers with notable works including The Nocturnal Brain and Seven Deadly Sins. Ethiran Kathiravan is a renowned Malayalam author known for his writings on science, arts, and films, contributing to leading publications. A recipient of prestigious awards like the Kerala Sahitya Academy Award, he holds a PhD in cell biology and has researched at institutions like JNU, Johns Hopkins, and the University of Chicago, with notable works including Malayaliയുടെ ജനിതകം and സിനിമയുടെ സാമൂഹിക വെളിപാടുകൾ. I welcome the esteemed guests to this wonderful session and everyone who has gathered here. Once again, I welcome everyone to the session.
Hello. Hello. So we have a distinguished writer here, uh, Guy Leschziner, and this is the book we are going to talk about: Seven Deadly Sins. He is a doctor. He is a neurobiologist, and he's asking, what is sin? How does your brain commit sin? How does it conflict with religion, or does it? It's kind of very sensitive issue right now because he's trying to tell us that many of the sins are kind of aberrant behavior of your brain. Sins, as in the Bible, or as in many of the religions, would need, if you commit sin, you need a redemption and you have to get salvation for that. ഇപ്പോൾ നമ്മുടെ ഇന്ത്യൻ കോൺസെപ്റ്റിൽ കാമം, ക്രോധം, ലോഭം, മോഹം, മതം, മാത്സര്യം, അങ്ങനെ ചില പ്രധാനമായിട്ടുള്ള പാപങ്ങളുണ്ട്. അപ്പം ഈ പാപങ്ങളൊക്കെ എന്താണ്? ഇറ്റ്സ് ജസ്റ്റ് ബീങ് ഹ്യൂമൻ. വെറുതെ മനുഷ്യരായിരിക്കുക എന്നുള്ളതാണ് അതിൻ്റെ അടിസ്ഥാനം. പാപങ്ങൾ ഒന്നും പാപങ്ങളല്ല. നമ്മൾ മൊറാലിറ്റിയിൽ നമ്മൾ ഡിഫൈൻ ചെയ്യുന്ന, നമ്മൾ നിർവചിക്കുന്ന പാപങ്ങളല്ല എന്നും അത് തലച്ചോറിൻ്റെ ചില അപഭ്രംശങ്ങളാണെന്നുമാണ് അദ്ദേഹം സ്ഥാപിക്കാൻ ശ്രമിക്കുന്നത്. അങ്ങനെയാണ് ഈ ബുക്ക് വളരെ പുതിയതാണ്. കഴിഞ്ഞ 2 മാസത്തിൽ കൂടുതലായിട്ടില്ല ഈ ബുക്ക് പ്രസിദ്ധീകരിച്ചിട്ട്. യെസ്. ആൻഡ് സിൻസ് he had been in Kerala only for a few days, and so I won't dare speak much Malayalam, but you can ask questions in Malayalam if you want at the end, or if you have doubts at the end, you can ask in Malayalam. I will translate to him. Um, so I was telling them that some Malayalam will be used here.
I understood perfectly.
Yeah, you
That's
did
okay,
it perfect.
yeah.
You should got it perfect. Yeah, okay. So there is a book being read very well all over the world. I came to know about this book when I was reading science magazines like Nature or Science. And this is getting rave reviews right now. Sins and the biology of being human. So I'm going to ask him, how did you land up in this subject? What did you decide to deal with this delicate, or not delicate, controversial subject? What made you think in as a neuroscientist or as a doctor?
Well, I'm obviously a very insensitive person because I chose this subject in order to try and understand. So the thrust of all of my work is really how our brains, the functions and the structures of our brains, influence every aspect of what it means to be human. So when it comes to how we see the world, how we interact with each other, how we behave, how we ascribe moral value to the acts that we undertake, how we sleep. So that's very much the angle from which I come. And historically, I've always taken individuals who sit at the extremes of the human experience. So individuals who've had serious problems with the way their brain functions or is structured, and try to extrapolate those individuals, the experiences of those individuals, and what study of those individuals tells us about how that aspect of our humanity is influenced by the brain for all of us. So it's about taking the extremes and applying them to everybody. And that's the case with this book as well. It's taking individuals who have very extreme aspects of behaviors that we deem sinful, trying to illustrate how the basis for those behaviors sits within our brains, in our bodies, in our genetics, in our histories, and just trying to reframe those behaviors as they apply to all of us.
So how do you define a sin according to as you read in general about sin? How do you define it in the new context after this book or during when you were writing this book?
Yeah.
How do you define it?
So I don't define it myself, because I
Right.
think that, sin, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder. But the most popular beholder, certainly in the Western world and to some degree elsewhere, is obviously religion, certain forms of religion. And in particular, the Christian church has characterized sinful behaviors into what are termed the 7 deadly sins. Now, of course, that comes from elsewhere. It has an older origin, and there are similarities to pretty much every religion on the surface of the planet that tries to categorize certain behaviors that it sees as harmful, morally degenerate, and categorize them. And so really it's from my own experience in the clinical world, seeing individuals who illustrate these kinds of behaviors, but also reflecting a little on how these kinds of behaviors have affected my own life, my own family, and indeed those individuals that I've interacted with, that has made me very keen to try and understand them a little better.
So in the book at many places, you have clearly marked that some of these so-called sins could be treated by medicines, by modern clinical gadgetries and all. The sins as defined as you said, you could treat a sin. What are others supposed to take from that? It's a difficult question.
Yeah.
That if a sin could be treated by medical means, what is all about it? Yes.
Yeah, well, of course, sins, to use that expression, and I really want to move away from the term sins, but as a shortcut, this is what doctors often do. We often see individuals whom either serious mental health issues or serious brain injury has resulted in behaviors that have changed, behaviors that are uncomfortable, that are damaging to themselves or to others. And so for those individuals, we often prescribe medications in a way that can sometimes help improve behavior in order to improve the experience of life, both for that individual, but also those individuals around them. So I think this is not a new concept, but I think that what we have really learned in the last few years is that the range of ways in which diseases, disorders, even common variants in our genetic structure or our childhood experiences and the effects of our childhood experiences on how our brains develop, how their structure and function changes. And so there has been this increased understanding that there are many influences on our behavior for every single one of us that are outside of our control. So I think that raises some important questions, because if there are influences that are outside of our control for all of us, then it raises questions of moral responsibility. And I don't seek to answer those, by the way. I'm asking the question. But it also raises the possibility, as you say, that if you understand those contributors to our behaviors, then you can also, to some extent, identify treatments or factors that might resolve those. Because ultimately, you have to ask what the basis of morality is, what the basis of criminal law is, what the basis of all these laws within our society are, which is to make our world a better place, to improve life for ourselves and every community.
So in many pages, you kind of clearly say that you can pinpoint a certain part of the brain, or even by modern techniques like fMRI, what is happening at that moment, what is happening and where it is happening. That means physically you are seeing, you can look at the point in the brain and look, that is the center, that is, he is doing a scene. So a neurobiologist is looking at the image and you look, that's is that part of the practical world? That's what we are in. Like, എന്താണെന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ ഈ പുസ്തകത്തിനകത്ത് കൃത്യമായിട്ട് പറയുന്നുണ്ട്, ഒരു പറയുന്ന 7 പാപങ്ങൾ, കാമം, ക്രോധം, ലോഭം എന്താണെങ്കിലും അത് ബ്രെയിനിൻ്റെ ഒരു പ്രത്യേക സ്ഥലത്ത് ചില ന്യൂറോൺ വലയങ്ങളിൽ നടക്കുന്ന ആക്ടിവിറ്റി ആയിട്ട് നമ്മൾക്ക് കാണാം എന്നുള്ളതാണ്. അപ്പോൾ ഡോക്ടർ ഒരു സ്കാനിങ് ഫിഗർ ഡോക്ടർ കാണുകയാണെങ്കിൽ അത് പിൻ പോയിന്റ് ചെയ്ത് പറയാൻ പറ്റും, ഇതാ ഇവിടെയാണ്, ഇവൻ്റെ പാപം ഇവിടെയാണ് നടന്നുകൊണ്ടിരിക്കുന്നത്, ചെയ്തിരിക്കുന്നത്, അതിനെ ട്രീറ്റ് ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റും എന്നുള്ളതാണ്. സോ ഇൻ ദ പ്രാക്ടിക്കൽ വേൾഡ് you have brought it into something more real than abstract. Is it the case? Do you think so?
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly there are areas of the brain that we know are involved in particular behaviors like lust, like gluttony.
Yes.
And we understand the relationship between these particular areas of the brain and those behaviors that they precipitate or control. Unfortunately, in medicine, we know that if we, for example, damage your lust center, that is not only going to affect your lust, it's going to affect other parts of your personality as well.
Sure.
And that's the basis, for example, for the craze in doing lobectomies or frontal lobotomies in people with serious mental health issues in the 1950s and on. What we found was that if you perform a major operation for somebody, yes, you will control their certain aspects of their behavior, but you'll also have some very damaging consequences as well. But I think that the fact that there are these areas of the brain that are specialized for these kinds of behaviors illustrates something else which is really important, which is that these sins basically are normal behaviors that are part and parcel of what it means to be human. If you think about lust, without lust, without the desire to have sex, we would be extinct as a species. This is a absolutely crucial aspect of what it means for the human race to continue. Without gluttony, without the need to try and maintain our calorie intake, obviously we live in a very different world now to the world that we inhabited when we were evolving. But the need to maintain calories and seek them out, to have a very strong drive to seek them out, is really part and parcel of what it is to be alive. And so the distinction between what is normal human behavior and what is sin is purely, I think, a function of the intensity of that behavior and whether or not it's appropriate to the circumstances you find yourself in.
In some cases, I have clearly mentioned that genetic diseases like Huntington's, it comes with serious behavioral issues. Could be classified as one of the sins, Huntington's.
Yeah.
But it's just a genetic element and it could run in your family. So can we brand that family as a family of sinners? Look at the family and say, look at that family, the family of sinners, because genetically, you are getting it. The family is branded genetically. Yes, ഹണ്ടിങ്ടൺസ് അസുഖം എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞൊരു അസുഖമുണ്ട്. അത് ജനറ്റിക്കലി പാരമ്പര്യമായിട്ട് നിങ്ങൾക്ക് കിട്ടുന്നതാണ്. അപ്പോൾ അതിൽ പെരുമാറ്റ പ്രശ്നങ്ങളുണ്ട്. ആ അസുഖം വരുന്നവർക്ക് പെരുമാറ്റ പ്രശ്നങ്ങളുണ്ട്. അത് നിങ്ങൾ പാരമ്പര്യമായിട്ട് കിട്ടുന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ നിങ്ങൾ പാരമ്പര്യമായിട്ട് നിങ്ങളുടെ കുടുംബം പാപികളുടേതാണോ എന്നൊരു ചോദ്യം വരുന്നുണ്ട് അവിടെ. അതാണ് ഞാനിപ്പോൾ ചോദിച്ചത്.
So Huntington's is a really good example, but perhaps an even better example is a condition called Brunner syndrome. So Brunner syndrome is a rare genetic disorder whereby there is a genetic mutation that results in an inability to break down certain chemicals within the brain, chemicals like adrenaline and serotonin. And so as a result, in individuals who carry this mutation, they have very, very high levels of aggression, very high levels of aggression, to the extent where multiple family members end up being convicted of violent crimes, some even murder. So that's a really good illustration, I think, of a single gene that has very limited consequences, not like Huntington's disease, which is a degenerative brain condition, but actually where a single chemical change results in very, very heightened levels of violence and aggression. Now, the question, and again, it's a question I'm putting to you, is are those individuals sinful, or are they entirely, is their behavior entirely a consequence of a single change in their genetic code that has led to dramatic changes in their behavior?
That happens. So now coming to the question of morality. Morality is always defined, as you mentioned before, on the sins you commit. So if it is part of being human, എന്നുവെച്ചാൽ മനുഷ്യനായിരിക്കുക എന്നുള്ളതിൻ്റെ കൂടെ ഈ പാപങ്ങളും അതിനോടൊപ്പം വരികയാണ്. നമ്മളുടെ തലച്ചോറിൻ്റെ അപഭ്രംശങ്ങളാൽ ഈ പാപവും അതിനോടൊത്ത് വരികയാണ്. അപ്പോൾ ഈ പാപം അതിനോടൊത്ത് വരുമ്പോൾ അതെങ്ങനെയാണ് നമ്മുടെ ഒരു മോറൽ, ധാർമ്മികമായ ഒരു ലോകത്ത് നമ്മൾ എങ്ങനെ അതിനെ നിർവചിക്കും എന്നുള്ളത് ഒരു പ്രത്യേക പ്രശ്നമാണ്. കാരണം ഇത് ബീയിങ് ഹ്യൂമൻ, നമ്മളൊരു മനുഷ്യനായിരിക്കുക എന്നുള്ളത് മാത്രമേ നമ്മൾ ചെയ്യുന്നുള്ളൂ. ഞാനൊരു മനുഷ്യനായിട്ട് മാത്രമേ ഇവിടെ പിറന്നിട്ടുള്ളൂ. എൻ്റെ പെരുമാറ്റങ്ങളിൽ നിങ്ങൾ അപഭ്രംശങ്ങൾ കാണുന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ അതെങ്ങനെയാണ് തെറ്റാകുന്നുള്ളത് എൻ്റെ തലച്ചോറിൻ്റെ പ്രകടനങ്ങളാണ് അവ എന്നുള്ളത്. So how should we, or you, or all of us face the question, or I don't know whether it is a question, how do you define morality in this sense? And because most of the religions are based on this sin and redemption and salvation. So when it comes to the sin, if you don't define it properly, it's a problem in a moral society, in a legally abiding society. It's an issue. It is, yes.
So I think that at first glance it sounds like what I'm saying is, oh, don't believe in sin, it's completely irrelevant. That's not at all what I'm saying. So I think the question of morality can be more easily defined as to a good moral act is one that is beneficial to yourself as an individual, but also to the society that you live in. And you can define society very narrowly in terms of your family, or you can define it much more widely in terms of humanity at large. But essentially, something that has bad moral value is something that causes harm to yourself or to somebody around you. Now, whether you define morality as being down to the individual act or the individual person is something that I would perhaps disagree with a little bit based upon, for example, Christian doctrine. But it doesn't negate the fact that actually, what all of these religions do, and it's what the criminal law does as well, is it tries to provide a framework very clearly defining the acts that are beneficial and the acts that are of negative value, but also to provide reward and punishment that is applicable to all of those kinds of behaviors. Now, the criminal system defines reward as you going free and punishment as you being incarcerated.
There.
In religion, those two aspects are either redemption and the promise of reward in the afterlife, or promise of punishment in the afterlife, but it's compounded by the fact that in addition there is the punishment of society, because it has that framework that says this action is good or this action is bad. So it provides some very potent reinforcers to facilitate behaviors that are good and to prevent things that are bad. It's no different. In that regard,
So in the
at
legal
least.
system, in the same way, in the legal system, we need to tackle this. കാരണം നിയമപരമായ വ്യവസ്ഥകളിൽ ഇത് വന്നു പെടുമ്പോൾ നമുക്ക് തീർച്ചയായും അറിയേണ്ടതുണ്ട്. ഇത് ജനറ്റിക്കായിട്ട് ഇത് നിങ്ങളുടെ ഫാമിലി റൺ ചെയ്യുന്നു, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ നിങ്ങളുടെ തലച്ചോറിൻ്റെ അപഭ്രംശം ആണെങ്കിൽ കോടതിയിൽ ഇതെങ്ങനെ, ഈ വ്യവഹാരം കോടതിയിൽ എങ്ങനെയാണ് ഒരു നമ്മൾ നീതിയുടെ ഒരു വ്യവസ്ഥകൾ നമ്മൾ എങ്ങനെ നിലനിർത്തുന്നു, നമ്മൾ എങ്ങനെ ഉളവാക്കിയെടുക്കുന്നു എന്നുള്ള വലിയൊരു ചോദ്യമാണ്. കാരണം ഇത് ഹ്യൂമൻ ബിഹേവിയർ ആണ് അതിൻ്റെ കാരണം. അത് പണ്ട് ജനറ്റിക്സ് കോടതിയിൽ വന്നത് പെറ്റേണിറ്റി സൂട്ടിലാണ്. അച്ഛൻ ആരാണെന്ന് അറിയാൻ വേണ്ടി DNA ഉപയോഗിക്കുക എന്നുള്ളതാണ്. സസ്പെക്റ്റഡ് ഫാദേഴ്സ്, സംശയമുള്ള 3-4 ആണുങ്ങളുടെ മുഴുവൻ DNA പരിശോധിച്ച് ആരാണ് അച്ഛൻ എന്ന് തീരുമാനിക്കുന്നതിനാണ് ആദ്യമായിട്ട് കോടതിയിൽ DNA പരിശോധന വന്ന്, ജനറ്റിക്സ് ആദ്യമായിട്ട് കോടതിയിൽ വന്ന്. ഇനി കോടതിയിൽ ഇതുപോലെ ഒരു ന്യൂറോ സയൻറ്റിസ്റ്റ് വരേണ്ടി വരുമോ? saying in Malayalam, in the court, are they going to call neuroscientists to elaborate or to ratify? What would a judge say? Well, I don't know about this. I will call some neuroscientist to tell me what I should do. Because I think that's where the book is going to.
But
Yes.
they do that already.
They
you know.
do it
I
already.
get regular emails from
You do?
courts
Okay.
to say,
Right.
please can you come and
Yes.
assess this
Should
patient
be.
or this individual. This is part and parcel of our legal system. Our legal system, at least in the UK, in the US, and I suspect in India too, recognises the fact that there are factors outside of our control from a medical perspective that can lead us less liable to conviction in a court of law. A good example from my day-to-day practice is individuals who commit acts while sleepwalking, for example, or individuals who commit criminal acts that have happened after they've had an epileptic seizure. So this is part and parcel of our legal system. Where it gets slightly more complicated is, for example, we talked about this syndrome called Brunner syndrome, which is where a particular mutation in a particular gene causes people to become very aggressive. But we now know that variants within that gene, so not mutations but common variants that we all have, influences our level of aggression. And so there have been cases in the US, in Australia, in Italy, for example, where individuals have checked the sequence of their variants in that particular gene and used that to mitigate in sentencing for murder or very serious violent crimes. And the question, I guess, is where do you define that line between what is totally outside your control, what is partially within your control, and what is completely within your control? Is it the doctor who should be making that call? Is it the judge? Is it the psychiatrist? Is it the philosopher? Is it the priest? And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I think that what's important is that we understand that there is nuance to all of this, and that this is not a straightforward black and white issue as is often presented.
Okay. പാപം മനുഷ്യനോടൊപ്പം വരികയാണെങ്കിൽ എന്തൊരു കുമ്പസാരിക്കണം. പാപം ഇറ്റ്സ് ബീങ് ഹ്യൂമൻ, മനുഷ്യനായിരിക്കുന്നതിൻ്റെ ഭാഗമാണെങ്കിൽ നിങ്ങൾക്ക് പാപം ചെയ്തതിൽ എന്തെങ്കിലും സങ്കടം തോന്നേണ്ടതുണ്ടോ? ആ ചോദ്യം വളരെ വലിയ സങ്കടമാണ് വാസ്തവത്തിൽ. എങ്ങനെയാണ് നമ്മൾ പാപത്തിൽ നിന്നും, പാപമാണെങ്കിൽ എങ്ങനെയാണ് വിമുക്തി, എവിടെയാണ് മോക്ഷം? അത്തരം കാര്യങ്ങൾ കൂടെ ഇവിടെ ഈ ന്യൂറോ സയൻസ് ഇവിടെ വരുമ്പോൾ പ്രശ്നം എന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ ഇത്തരം പുതുതായ ചോദ്യങ്ങൾ വരികയാണ്. I was telling them what I was going to ask. Excuse me. If there's no need to feel, or is there a necessity to feel remorse about, should he go to a religious head and tell that him or her, I have sinned, oh Lord, I need redemption? That becomes immaterial, totally immaterial. Yes.
Yeah. So I think that remorse and redemption are ultimately, regardless of whether you look at them from a religious perspective or you look at them from a much more humanistic or atheistic perspective, ultimately these are tools that reduce the likelihood that you will sin again, that you will perform that act again. Because remorse and understanding that you've done something bad, hopefully might mitigate against you performing that bad thing again in the future. And redemption is a tool by which you can provide the possibility of reward for remorse. And so ultimately, these things are no different to what we were discussing before, which is that ultimately what we want, whether you feel that whether you're religious or not, is to improve people's behavior for the common good in this life rather than the afterlife. And remorse and redemption are very good tools to try and achieve that if you are minded that way.
That's going to redefining the pillars of religion itself, because you have an explanation or a kind of ratification from a neuroscientist point of view. It's going to hit at different places of the big, thick rock pillars of religion. Don't you think so?
I think it depends on how you choose to interpret what I say. You know, I don't think anything of what I say runs completely counter to the principles of the religions. I think that what I'm really saying is that, look, these kinds of behaviours are within all of us, and that is not that far removed from the concept of original sin in certain aspects of Christianity, and that, ultimately what we should be focusing on, whether that would be from a sort of a medical perspective, a biological perspective, from a humanistic perspective, or from a religious perspective, all of it should be focused in trying to tame those forces that lie within all of us, to tame them for the common good, and to try and minimize harm to human societies throughout the world.
Since we don't have much time, I'm kind of shifting the focus. മറ്റൊരു കാര്യം ഈ പുസ്തകത്തിൽ വിസ്തരിച്ചിരിക്കുന്നത് ഫ്രീ വിൽ എന്നുള്ളത്, നമുക്ക് സ്വതന്ത്ര ചിന്തയുണ്ടോ എന്നുള്ളതാണ്. ഇപ്പോഴത്തെ ന്യൂറോ സയൻസ് പഠനങ്ങൾ, ബോധജ്ഞാനത്തെക്കുറിച്ചുള്ള പഠനങ്ങൾ തെളിയിക്കുന്നത് നമുക്ക് സ്വതന്ത്ര ചിന്ത എന്നുള്ളത് ഇല്ല എന്നും, എല്ലാം നേരത്തെ തീരുമാനിച്ചതാണെന്നും ആണ് വാസ്തവത്തിൽ. നമ്മുടെ തലച്ചോറിൻ്റെ പ്രവർത്തനങ്ങളാലും നമ്മൾ വളർന്ന സാഹചര്യങ്ങളാലും മറ്റു പലതരത്തിലുള്ള സ്വാധീനങ്ങളാലും സ്വാതന്ത്ര്യം, there's no free will എന്നാണ് പുതിയ ശാസ്ത്രം പ്രഘോഷിക്കുന്നത്. there's no free will. സ്വതന്ത്രമായൊരു ചിന്ത നമുക്കില്ല, എല്ലാം നേരത്തെ മുൻകൂട്ടി തീരുമാനിക്കപ്പെട്ടിരിക്കുകയായിരുന്നു. അതിനെക്കുറിച്ച് വളരെ നന്നായിട്ട് ഇദ്ദേഹം ഈ പുസ്തകത്തിൻ്റെ അവസാന ഭാഗത്തിൽ വിവരിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ട്. I was talking about the free will. We don't have much time, so free. I know that I know how you end it. You yourself would doubt a little bit about that, but can you just explain what is free will or what is not free will for them? Yes.
So different philosophers describe free will in different ways. So it's the first thing. But I think that for most of us, what free will means is that at any particular point, in any particular situation, we have the ability to choose to make one decision rather than another. So to say something nice or say something nasty, to turn left or right, to order, a Coca-Cola or a water in a restaurant.
True.
But actually, there is a school of both in terms of neuroscience, but also in terms of philosophy, that suggests that free will is an illusion, that actually we don't have free will at all, that any decision that we have is something called an obligate decision. And actually, if you look at some of the very ancient religious texts, the ancient Hindu texts, for example, they recognize the fact that actually this is a possibility. And so this area of whether or not we have the ability to make a choice or not, or whether that is all predetermined by our brains, has taxed many researchers for many, many years, until the 1980s, when a chap called Libet did a really rather fascinating experiment, which I'm not going to bore you with, but essentially he asked people to mark a point on a revolving clock at which they first became aware of the impulse to press a particular button to stop the clock. And what he found was that there was an electrical signal that was present in certain areas of the brain that had previously been associated with making a decision to act, preparing to act, and conscious awareness, suggesting that actually that the brain had made a decision several seconds before you actually chose to act, which sounds very small as a discovery, but if you think about it, it actually raises fundamental questions about our conscious ability to make a decision, because if our brain is already making that decision for us several seconds before, then does that mean we actually have free will, or has our brain already taken that decision a long time before we're conscious of it? Now, a lot of people have argued extensively about this decision, about this research, but there remains an ongoing school of neuroscience that very clearly feels that there is enough evidence to suggest that all our decisions are made by our brains before we are actually consciously aware of them, that this ability to make decisions is what's termed an epiphenomenon, so that it's really just a bystander effect of the processes that happen within our brains. I don't come down hard one way or another on this, but what I can very clearly say is that I've seen many patients, some of whom I describe in my books, in whom their ability to make a decision has been entirely wrestled away from them, that they clearly don't have free will. Now, whether that's as a result of terrible brain injury, a neurodegenerative condition, genetic mutation, they have lost free will. And I see many individuals who have lost free will in that particular moment by a particular condition, and I talked about some of the issues that we sometimes get consulted about in courts of law. So it's very, very clear that there are individuals who do not have free will. Now, the big question, and I think this is really the focus of my book, is if we know that all of us have influences on our behavior that are outside of our control, then it could be argued that to some extent all of us also do not have full free will, because there are factors that are beyond us, factors that are beyond our upbringing, beyond our brains, beyond our genetics, actually a function of all of those, that influence a specific act or a specific decision that we make within the moment. Does that mean that we have no free will? Well, possibly. But I think it's more likely that, as with every aspect of the human experience, there is a big spectrum of what free will is and how free will is experienced.
So does it mean that when we are born with a special kind of wiring to control or regulate or channelize your thoughts and your will, or is it an inbuilt part of the brain? You got it during brain evolution. This free will thing. How do you get it? How do you, like today? I'm going there and I'm asking, hey, I will not have chicken curry. I will have tandoori chicken today. So was it wired in me long ago? I haven't even heard about the tandoori chicken when I was young. So where did it
So
come
I'm not
from?
sure the choice between going for tandoori chicken or roast chicken
chicken
has
curry,
been
yeah.
extensively investigated in
Yeah,
the
I know.
scientific community.
No, for a common man, it is a
yeah.
question.
But,
Yes.
but I think that, look, we have very good evidence that genetics influences the structure of our brains, how our brains develop. And there are countless examples of genetic changes that influence brain structure and function. We also know that what is happening to us when we're still within our mother's womb has a very important effect on how our brain develops. And, for example, and this is an interesting thing for you all to do, is just to have a look at the fingers on your right hand. Because if your ring finger is longer than your index finger, the ratio between those two fingers is related to how much testosterone you were exposed to
yes.
in your mother's womb. And we know that that correlates both in men and women to certain measures of aggression or competitiveness in later life. So something as simple as how much testosterone you were exposed to. There are other studies, for example, that were done in Holland after the Second World War that showed that depending on when your mother was starved, there was a famine during the Second World War in Holland. And depending on what your age was inside your mother's womb, when your mother starved, influences your adult body weight and your likelihood of developing cardiovascular disease. Because essentially, that starvation in your mother's womb fundamentally changes the structure and the function of certain aspects of your brain, that influence your appetite, but also influence how your organs metabolize food. So there are environmental factors before you're born. There are aspects that are related to your upbringing. So your parenting style has a huge determinant on whether or not, for example, in the context of pride that I write about, whether or not your parents are likely to induce high self-esteem or high levels of narcissism. So all of these aspects before birth, based in our evolution, in our genetics, in our mother's womb, in our childhood, and even in adulthood, ultimately go on to affect the function and the structure of the brain. The brain is a plastic organ that changes throughout our lives. It's constantly evolving. It's constantly being influenced both by nature and nurture. And so, yes, perhaps it is causing you to choose tandoori chicken.
So what does that mean that we are bound by, I cannot say something super being, it's our own brain. So what is that thing? It's all neuronal system, the neuronal network and wiring and everything. So what is that thing which controls everything as a super mind? I think you try to go through a little bit in that. What is there? Is that you even address the mind and matter, the brain and mind? Is there a soul like that? So if there is a soul, is there a free will for the soul? Is it because we think that the soul is the most prime thing, the divine thing?
Yeah.
So where are we in that
Are you
sense?
asking me where the soul is?
Where's the soul? No, you cannot ask. Okay, if you can tell, you can. Please tell me where it is.
Well,
Yeah.
I'll either win a Nobel
I know,
Prize
yes.
or get cancelled
True.
by various
True.
religions around the world.
Yeah.
So look, I guess that this depends on your vantage point. My own view, and look, we all look at a particular situation, a particular set of circumstances from our own vantage point, depending on our own experiences. Reality is different for everyone, and so I start off my answer in this regard. As somebody who studies the brain, who sees a lot of individuals who have got changes to the way they see the world, the way that they understand the world, the way that they act within the world, as a result of changes within their brain. My answer to that is going to be very different from the answer that you would get from a priest, from a philosopher. From my perspective, the soul is a function of the brain, like consciousness is a function of the brain. And I understand that many people out there will not agree with me, but that is that's what my experience and my study and my knowledge tell me.
So is that that so-called soul predicting or regulating or control the will? Because I don't have, the book says, the current theory says that here you don't have a free will. So is that, who is controlling it?
It doesn't say that.
It doesn't say that.
There are certainly
That's
some schools
the difficult
of thought.
part. That is the difficult
certainly
part.
some schools of thought that would say you don't have free
You
will.
don't have.
Yeah.
So, but who is?
So that's a very
Who's
what is
controlling
termed a deterministic view. That basically that every aspect of our being, of our experience, of what we do, is simply a function of the connections between the various cells in our brains. That everything in our lives, everything in human experience can be explained by the nuts, the bolts, the underlying machinery of the brain. That is perhaps a view that I have more sympathy for than that there is a separate part, a spiritual part of us that is separate from our brains. But these arguments have taxed humanity for the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, and I think will tax us for another 2,000 or 3,000 years.
3,000
I don't think
right.
we've got the answer yet.
Okay, so the time is always, see, that's that clock running there.
Oh,
So yeah,
we're
so this
almost
is the
at-
time for.
Phew,
Is it
you're
the time
just
for
about to, you're
discussion?
making me sweat now upon
Yeah,
my
sorry,
knowledge of
sorry.
philosophy and
ഓക്കെ
religion.
ചോദ്യങ്ങൾ ചോദിക്കാനുള്ളത് ഡിസ്കഷൻ്റെ സമയമാണ്. മലയാളത്തിലോ ഇംഗ്ലീഷോ ചോദ്യം ചോദിക്കാൻ പ്രശ്നമില്ല. മലയാളം ചോദിക്കുകയാണെങ്കിൽ ഞാൻ അത് ട്രാൻസ്ലേറ്റ് ചെയ്ത് അദ്ദേഹത്തോട് ചോദിച്ചോളാം. അപ്പം മലയാളത്തിലോ ഇംഗ്ലീഷിലോ ചോദ്യങ്ങൾ ചോദിക്കുക പ്ലീസ്. കിടന്നു വരൂ. ഓക്കെ, വൺ അറ്റ് എ ടൈം. Can one.
Okay, sir. I already know about your book from Ethiran, sir. Okay. My doubt is that actually sins are aberrations of brain that you explain in your book. But these aberrations can be treated by social experiences or from our culture or faith. Okay, I think that not only the genes, but also some situations where we live can influence the sins of a person.
Yeah. No,
Nature,
yeah.
is he not talking about nature and nurture?
No,
Kind of,
I mean,
right?
I entirely agree with you. And in fact, a lot of my book is dedicated to the fact that actually, for example, the religious laws, if you will, or those thoughts, the framework for morality that religion gives, undoubtedly affects human behaviour. And I think that is that nurture argument about the society that you live in, the reward and the punishment that is meted out by society is an extremely powerful tool in terms of modulating our behaviour. So I entirely agree with you. Look, if we all lived in a world where it was, and I'm trying to choose an example that is not going to upset people. I'm thinking on my feet, so please forgive me if I do upset somebody. But if we all lived in a world where it was entirely acceptable to see a dog in the street and kill it immediately, and there was no punishment for it, and in fact in society that was seen as potentially a beneficial thing, then of course that would encourage people to go out and kill dogs. If we live in a society whereby that's completely unacceptable, where if you were seen to kill a dog in the street, you would be completely ostracized, you might even get a fine or get put in prison, then that is a very, very good way of preventing people from killing dogs. And I think that if you take that example and apply it to beating your wife or, extramarital relations, then I think the same applies. So I entirely agree.
Hi guys. An interesting conversation. I just want to come back to the point of free will and the scientific approach, the deterministic approach that we take, and to address this free will question, right? So I think
mic ഒന്ന് വായുടെ നേരെ പിടിക്കണം.
yeah. So
It's very loud, the aircon.
okay, sorry.
Can you come over here? Can you come over here?
Yeah,
please?
sure.
All right, thank you.
So my question is like you kind of pointed out that like there is no absolute free will because like so some randomness that we can't account. It's an open-ended world, and like science can always look approach it with certain like it's always limited. Like the control conditions that we can implement in our studies is like always limited. So the openness of this entire setup is it's always like we can, as long as we don't have any hold on to this openness, like I think like we don't have ever we can ever say that like we have free will, or I mean we can't exactly negate the statement that like we have free will, right?
You asking whether we will ever be able to prove that we don't have free will, or are you asking if there are some individuals who do have free will? Is that, which of those? Yeah. Yeah. So yeah. No, and I think that is certainly something that, for example, people have argued about, which is that, for example, if you take the view that everything is as a result of your brain, there are some people who would say, well, even if you were able to account for every single atom within the brain, you still wouldn't fundamentally understand the concept of free will, because there are other potential mechanisms, like, for example, quantum theory, that might influence whether or not you make one choice or another. And you know, it may be that at some point our technological advances allow us to understand the brain on an entirely atomic or even subatomic level, in which case that might be a possibility which we can say, well, actually free will does not exist. You'll note that I am not saying there is no such thing as free will. You know, what I'm saying is something slightly more nuanced. I'm saying that there are some individuals for whom there is quite clearly no free will, in my view. There are other individuals in whom their genetic burden, their brain structure burden, their upbringing burden might be sufficient to negate some free will that they may have in a particular setting. And then there are some of us who are untainted by genetics, you know, had perfect childhoods, never had any difficulties with our parents, you know, breezed through life, for whom actually we have the ability to make the right choice at the right time, or at least be judged as having that ability. I think that there is likely a range here.
All right. So
No. My question is, after listening to this talks, I come to the a focus of confusion. That confusion is this: what about metaphysical reality? Metaphysical reality, does it consist of evolutionary process, and our brain is the product of evolutionary process? And what about the contribution of evolutionary process in the development of brain, and that also how this brain is very gradually developing into the very bright cognitive apparatus? How far these things will contribute into the development of Homo sapien, or human beings? Please get a clear picture of it if you can.
You know, is of utmost importance, because ultimately evolution is the tool through which our genetics have been defined. And you know, and there are lots of examples of evolutionary pressures driving our behaviors when it comes to, for example, our sexual behavior. So one of the really interesting evolutionary questions is, why is it that humans, unlike the vast majority of mammals, tend to go for long-term relationships, partners for life? Because actually, in some respects, it would make sense from an evolutionary perspective to basically try and procreate with as many people as possible, because then you have as much genetic variation in your offspring. But actually, if you look at the evolutionary theory behind choosing partners to procreate with, actually there is some clear evolutionary advantage to going down the long-term mating route. If you look at some of the factors that influence our appetite, there are very clear evolutionary mechanisms. Now, the difficulty that we have at the moment, and this applies both to our behavior but also to other aspects of humanity and cognition that you describe, is that we live in an environment that is not at all reflective of the evolutionary pressures that Homo sapiens has been for the last hundreds of thousands or millions of years. And so it's very difficult to make sense of some of those evolutionary pressures when we look at our modern lives. And I think that's going to create very different challenges for us as a species, you know, because there has been this sudden shift in terms of the pressures upon us that evolution places.
Molecular biologist Max Perus once said that life is a genetic lottery. My question is whether every baby is born by design or by default. And also you touched upon the criminality gene. My question is regarding Bill Clinton and the American Congress. His illegal relationship with Monica Lewinsky, is it predetermined or with the American ambience there? ഓരോ കുട്ടിയും ജനിക്കുന്നത് പ്രീ ഡിറ്റർമൈൻഡ് ആണോ അതോ മാക്സ് പെറസ് പറഞ്ഞ മാതിരി ഒരു ജനറ്റിക് ലോട്ടറിയുടെ ഭാഗമാണ്? പിന്നെ സാറ് ക്രിമിനാലിറ്റി ജീനിനെ പറ്റി പറഞ്ഞു. അമേരിക്കൻ കോൺഗ്രസിനകത്ത് വെച്ച് അവിടുത്തെ ഇന്ത്യയുടെ മോണിക്ക ലെവിൻസ്കിയുമായിട്ട് ബിൽ ക്ലിന്റൺ ഉണ്ടായ ഒരു ഇല്ലീഗൽ റിലേഷൻ ഈ വാസ് ഇറ്റ് പ്രീ ഡിറ്റർമൈൻഡ് ഓർ ബൈ ഡീഫോൾട്ട്?
So when a child is born, how much is predetermined in the brain? How much is accumulated by the other things around? That was one question. രണ്ടാമത്തെ ചോദ്യം എന്തായിരുന്നു? That was one question.
So-
There was one more question. എന്തായിരുന്നു രണ്ടാമത്തെ ചോദ്യം?
Sir, the American intern, Monica Lewinsky, and the American Congress,
Yes.
Bishop, Bill Clinton had a
Yes.
legal relationship with her.
Yes.
Was it due to the ambience present in the American Congress there, or is it predetermined? The
Okay.
criminality gene in him was active.
Okay. He was citing the issue with Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton affair thing. Was it
Okay.
all predetermined? If you think that's all predetermined,
What-
is
what-
Monica
what-
Lewinsky
Was his love of
going
cigars
to do this
defined by
anyway?
his genetics?
Yes.
Um, so,
That was-
so look, I think the answer to that is it's very difficult in one individual to say how much is due to genetics, how much is due to environment, how much is due to other factors. And when we talk about these things, we generally talk about we talk about it on a population basis. But what we know is it's quite possible that he was carrying some genes that predisposed to it, that predisposed to a personality that led him to seek power, for example, and all the things that come with power. It's quite possible, and we know that he had quite a hard upbringing, that his childhood had something to do with it. But can I say in one particular individual, well, 50% is due to your genes, 49% is due to your upbringing, and 1% is due to Monica Lewinsky being there on that day?
Sorry, the time is up. All other questions നിങ്ങൾ പുറത്ത് ചോദിക്കാം. സെഷൻ കഴിഞ്ഞ കാരണം കുറച്ച് സെക്കൻഡുകളെ മിച്ചമുള്ളൂ എന്നുള്ളത്. എനിവേ, നിങ്ങൾ കൂടുതൽ ചോദ്യമുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ തന്നെ നിങ്ങൾ ഈ ബുക്ക് തീർച്ചയായും വായിക്കണം. ഞാൻ ബുക്കിൻ്റെ പ്രൊപ്പഗാൻഡ, ഞാൻ ബുക്ക് സെയിൽസിന് വന്ന ആളല്ല, പക്ഷേ ദിസ് ഇസ് എ വണ്ടർഫുൾ thought inspiring book. You should buy it. And now it's getting popular. The book is very new. It's just less than 2 months old, so it's going to be a big seller, the big game changer book for sure.